Right, good morning and welcome to ECS3702. So today we are going to be looking at this question paper here, June 2021, as part of our revision. So maybe if we finish what's important on this paper, we can perhaps pick another paper for on Monday evening, and then from there can as well meet up on Tuesday. All right, so most of the question papers, like I indicated before, always want to start off with this here, the issues of absolute and absolute advantage and comparative advantage, these two issues. That's what you normally get for the first questions. And these are going to carry a total of 25 marks, right? They're going to carry a total of 25 marks most of the time, right? So if there's something that's very important for us when going into examinations, is to at least grab the first 25 marks, because this is just about some of the easiest things that we could get on this question paper. So I think we've done this over and over again, right? We've done this over and over again, but what we're going to do, we'll skip this part, right? We'll skip this part for now, and then we'll revert back to it towards the end of the class so that we can all participate. The reason why I actually wanted us to shift to Monday is because I was hoping to have as many people as possible so that we can participate in the calculations, especially when it comes to this.
Okay, Ntando, can I make a suggestion? Sorry to interrupt while you have started. Ne? I think then if ever people are not many, then there's no need.
Right. So this question in particular, we are going to cover last, right? Because like I said, this is an almost guaranteed question to come. So I really treat it with utmost respect, right? It's one of the questions that I can really guarantee that we're going to get. So we're going to come back to it, okay? But in any case, I'm sure we've done quite a lot of calculations on this over and over again. I think I remember in the other class as well, where we're all participating. So I want us to try and redo that. So I'm gonna open the Excel spreadsheet when we come back to question number 1, okay? So you'll be doing most of the talking on that one. All right, so 1B, which is still part of 1, was briefly explain the theories of absolute and comparative advantage. So we'll do that as well while highlighting any similarities and differences between the two. Okay, that's fine. All right, there we go. So on question number 2, two countries, Lunch and Punchy, or Lunch and Punchy, I don't know how to pronounce that. And then, so we have this hypothetical scenario here, 2 countries. These are the countries. So Lunch is a capital abundant country and Punchy is a labor abundant country. So both countries consume and produce iron and labor, right? Iron is capital intensive and labor is labor intensive. Using a graphical representation of Punchy, explain the 2 components of the gains of
Sorry,
trade.
Tando.
Yes.
Can you increase your screen? I can't see anything here.
All right, and I got the paper from you, by the way, ne? So if you have a laptop close by, you can as well open it on the side.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So note that you are not allowed to reproduce the diagram in the textbook, and you must use your own letters and numbers to answer the questions. No marks will be awarded for students who do not follow this instruction. So I was saying some time back, not really some time back, when this whole online exam thing started, people were not exactly required to draw diagrams, right? You could just make reference to a diagram in the textbook, and then maybe you pretty much get the same marks for that, right? But now, because things are evolving, we're definitely going to be required to be doing these diagrams, right? I think, especially with the other class, Ecs3702, we've been practicing on doing diagrams. So we are going to do the same here for specific diagrams, right? I'm going to ask us to do specific specific diagrams, particularly this one, and then the HO theory, and then partial equilibrium. We are going to do those three. So what we'll do for now, we'll basically go through the graph in the textbook and the explanations thereof, and then I'll let you know how you can make changes on the graphs. And then thereafter, once you are done with the class, then I'm gonna ask you to draw the graphs right on a piece of paper, and then you can submit the graphs to me anytime today, so that we can have a look and see if we are implementing any of those changes. So this, I'm gonna fetch it now from the textbook. I think I have the textbook open here. Probably I don't know now. Okay, let me search for the textbook and then take us through to what we're supposed to do on the textbook. All right, I think I get it now. All right, right there. And then there's one question that I got in terms of, I can't remember now. I searched on my WhatsApp to try and see who sent me the question, but I couldn't see, where they were asking what graph we are supposed to draw and in what circumstances, in terms of when we're dealing with capital abundant countries and labor abundant countries. So I wanted to check the exact question the person who sent me, but I can't remember who it is. But once I remember, I'm going to address it in the group, right? So here we are dealing with, we need a graphical representation of the gains of trade, right? We need that graphical representation. So the tricky thing with these questions, most of the things that we find in international trade, they can, to some extent, more or less explain one and the same things. But what becomes tricky is the wording that they use, right? So the wording that they use is what really has to direct us towards which graph or which theory we are going to be looking at, right? So I'm gonna juxtapose between two theories that can explain this, right? The same thing, and you are also going to see that for yourself, right? But it's different drawings altogether, but they are all explaining the same thing. You see? So let's check that now in the textbook. So that in particular we can find on the standard theory of trade, right? We can find that on the standard theory of trade. So the distinction between what comes before and after standard theory of trade is the issue of increasing costs here, which is a more realistic assumption. So you realize that most of our discussions when we're talking about the gains of trade, etc., we're now dealing with a situation where we had this kind of shape for our PPFs, right, or PPCs, these product possibility curves, right? We had this kind of shape because of the assumption of increasing costs, right? So it's no longer a straight line like what maybe you would have found when dealing with something that is recurrent, you see. So that's the major difference there. But in any case, what we are looking for is this one here. Let's see. This is the one that we are looking for, illustrating the gains of trade under increasing costs. So the one other thing that I would say, if you do check this out, okay, so if you do notice, right, specifically on this illustration, they talk about gains of trade in increasing costs, but if you go to our question, the question doesn't state anything with regards to increasing costs, right? Neither does it talk about incomplete specialization and what have you, which is something that would even be more specific in assisting us, right, in terms of answering this question. So in theory, whichever graph that you decide to go for, in theory, you should be able to get the marks for that, because you are explaining what the question asked, given that the question is not specifying, right, in terms of increasing cost. So what I mean to say now is, you can still illustrate this in a situation of constant costs where you are going to be having a straight line running like that, because the question does not specify a situation of increasing costs, you see. But because we are dealing with UNISA now, we need to understand their line of thought, right? And understand that, okay, when they ask this, this is most likely what they are requiring us for us to do, you see. All right, so in explaining this graph now, we have nation 1 and nation 2, right? And then in most cases, nation 1 refers to the nation that is labor intensive, right? And I'm going to explain what that means when we talk of labor intensive. Sorry, I'm just shifting here to charge my phone, right? When we talk of a country being labor intensive, or sorry, it's labor abundant, my bad. When we talk of a country being labor abundant, right, which is in most cases, whenever we talk about nation 1, we're always referring to the nation that is labor abundant. We are either referring to two scenarios here. Number one, it's either there's just a lot of labor in the country, right? So which is in terms of sheer numbers, right? So this could be a situation where the population is just too high. And I think I always give an example of countries like Nigeria, countries like China, right? And then normally as a result of that, the labor is going to be cheap, right? Obviously, because there's just a lot of people available. So in most cases, we are dealing with unskilled labor, right? So there's going to be, once there's an abundance of that unskilled labor, the price is going to be low for that labor. That actually explains why unskilled labor is very cheap, right? So we normally do that with reference, or discuss that with reference to nation 1. So which means in an exam now, you want to identify which of the countries is labor abundant and which of the countries, and which should then mean the other country is capital abundant, right? Because we always deal two assumptions here to simplify our studies. We always assume two countries, and then if one country is labor abundant, then the other country is capital abundant, so that we can explain that. Okay, and then given now that nation 1 is labor abundant, right? And then this commodity X here is the labor intensive commodity. So by labor intensive commodity, we simply mean that this is the commodity that requires more labor, right? More labor than capital, right? So this is in terms of the ratio of L to K, right? Or K to L. It basically shows us that this one requires more labor than capital. So if we take this here now, if we bring this here, we have Lunchi here as the capital abundant country. So which means that Lunchi here is gonna be going with it's gonna be with country Y, right? It's going to be, sorry, I just got interrupted. This is gonna be nation 2, right? This one here, which is the capital one, which is the capital intensive. So which is the capital abundant one, right? So if we go back again,
Please,
so now
please,
that we are able,
Tando,
yes,
can you please go back to what you were explaining between capital and I didn't get it. And like you were saying, Lunchi is capital abundant. So you are saying on the graph that you were showing us, it means it will be the graph number 2, nation number 2. That's
yes,
what you are saying.
yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So once we've identified now, we are still dealing with the same thing. Okay. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Eh? That's why I'm being interrupted. I'm just trying to tell the person that I'm in class. Let me just sorry. Okay. say we'll call right after. Yeah, I'm sure he's got the message now. Yes, okay. Sorry, can I just take the call? Maybe it's something urgent.
Please take it because we are going to be distracted.
All right, I'm back now. It wasn't that important anyway. All right, so now that we've identified, in this instance, there are two countries, right? And then Lunchi is the capital abundant, so which means Panchi is the one that is labor abundant. So we can come back now to the graph and then try and mix it up. So like I said now, in all these cases that you find in the textbook, nation 1 is the one that's going to be labor abundant, and then nation 2 is the one that's always capital abundant. So which means in our explanations, this is what we are taking into consideration. But you can always rearrange this anyhow, right? Just as long as you understand what you're doing. Though I wouldn't exactly advise that, because of what's happening now with UNISA, they probably want to mark this according to how they've given us, right? So we must always stick to that. If you check, for instance, here, commodity X, this is the labor intensive commodity, and then commodity Y is the capital intensive commodity. So even if you switch these things around, so in other words, if you can rotate this graph, it still explains the same thing. It basically shows the same thing, right? Just as long as you don't mix up these things in terms of, for instance, if we said nation 1 is what here? Nation 1 is the one that is labor abundant, which is Panchi, this one, right? So which means in your graph, you probably have come and put Panchi there, right? So Panchi here must correspond with, if you look at the shape of this curve, right, you can see that there is more here on the X commodity, which is the labor intensive commodity. So if you have decided that this is going to be your Panchi, then it means the shape of your PPF must illustrate that there is an advantage in producing this labor intensive commodity. So which in this instance, which one is the labor intensive commodity? It's leather. So which means you must come here and put leather on that one. It must correspond with that there. So don't put punch here and then put labor there. And put the labor intensive commodity there, which is leather, right? It will not make any sense at all. You should get marked wrong for that. So I'm saying now, if for instance, you happen to swap things around, let's say you have put leather on the y-axis there, then which means you must also switch and then have the labor abundant country here, right, to illustrate that this one can produce more of that commodity than the other. So you can decide to shift it around anyhow. But like I said, I wouldn't exactly advise that. So it's always better that the one that is labor abundant must always be on the first panel here, which is going to be representative of nation 1, right? And then as you go here on the x-axis, you are going to put the labor intensive one, and then there the capital intensive one. So the shape of this basically gives us an idea now, that because, which explains, by the way, what I already said at the beginning, because nation 1 is abundant with labor, it has a lot of labor, we can therefore expect that they can produce more of the labor intensive commodity, right, of this labor intensive commodity. So which is illustrated now in this shape, right? You can even see that here we can get to a maximum of about, this is about 140, right, while here we're only getting to a maximum of 30. So this basically illustrates the point. So you're already showing your understanding, right, because in an exam you want to convince the markers as much as possible, right?
that you understand the concept. So that's the first concept that you should understand, that, okay, we are dealing with international trade, and some of the prerequisites for this trade to occur is that one nation must be more efficient in producing a certain commodity than the other, and this can be illustrated or can be best seen in the shape of these curves, right? So that's the first thing that we are doing. So which means when we are practicing now drawing these things, I will not expect that you draw a curve that exactly, or curves that exactly look the same. For instance, by looking the same, I mean, you can see that this one here is on 140 and this one, and it's going on 90 there. So you can't repeat the same diagram for both nation 1 and 2, right? Because it doesn't illustrate the point that we are trying to make. That because if it's the same, then these countries do not need to trade. You see, at least based on what we are doing here, these countries will not have to trade. So that's the first point. So your first point, therefore, is in drawing accurately a curve that looks like this. I think one of the lecturers was saying they are looking at these lines. They are looking at these lines, how you draw these lines, the shapes of these lines, you see. So in other words, by shapes, we are also talking about where does this line cut the x-axis? Where does it cut the y-axis? Does it illustrate the point perfectly? All right. So that's point number one. So which means in editing any graph, you therefore want to put the correct countries there, right? Even if you are going to be checking my stuff, then you want to see if it corresponds. If I'm saying that nation 1 is labor abundant, then does it correspond with the shape of this curve in terms of with the given x-axis commodity? Does it correspond? Does it make sense? You see. So once you see now, we are saying punchy is labor abundant, and then the labor intensive leather. Once you see these things not corresponding, you don't have leather there and you don't have that country there, then you know there's an issue now. It's a disaster, right? And then just to explain what's happening on this graph. So what we have here is an indifference curve, right? These blue curves there, they are indifference curves. So what does an indifference curve basically tell us? It shows us the different combinations between the consumption of Y and X, where I would say they bring about equal satisfaction. Where I would say they bring about equal satisfaction, right? So this basically illustrates the demand of this commodity within that particular country. So the indifference curve, because we are talking about the consumption of that commodity. So it should mean we are referring to the demand. So it's a part of demand where we are saying we are happy about it, right? We are basically satisfied. So where these meet now, and then by the way, the PPF gives us a boundary or the limit of what we can produce in the country, right? So it's a product possibility curve. So we can't go beyond that. We can't produce beyond that. So in autarky now, which is without international trade, where the indifference curve and the PPF curve basically coincide, where they meet here, right? Where they touch each other, that's where you get what we call equilibrium in isolation, right? Which basically gives us the relative prices of the commodities in the particular country. And in terms of prices here, we talk of relative prices because we are looking at the price of Y to X or the price of X to Y, right? So hence we refer to that as relative price, which is the comparative price. How much of Y are you willing to sacrifice to get X basically gives you the price of X in terms of Y. So it's just the same as money. How much money are you willing to let go of? If you're going to say money is also a commodity, right? So how much of money are you willing to let go of to get a certain thing basically gives you the price of that thing. So now, because we are not exactly dealing with money and we're dealing with two commodities, then you want to know the price of one commodity in terms of the other. So you should remember now that that basically also gives you the opportunity cost, right? So it works both ways. Opportunity cost in terms of consumption again, and then opportunity cost in terms of production, right? So what does this opportunity cost therefore tell us? It's the gradient on any point there, Right? It represents the opportunity cost, which is how much of one commodity are you willing to sacrifice in order for you to get another. So if it's the PPF, we are saying in order for you to produce another, right? The fact that we are dealing with increasing costs here, it shows us that the gradient is not exactly the same. It's a curve, right? It's not exactly a straight line, so it's not going to be the same, illustrating that at some point you are willing to sacrifice more and more to get something, or maybe at some point you're willing to sacrifice less and less to get something, right? Either in consumption or in production, right? So this is just a description of what's going on here. So which means where the gradient on indifference curve 1 is the same as the gradient on the PPF curve, that's where you get the relative price, right? The relative price, which is at that point, right? It can really be anywhere in theory, but for our illustration, we always use this point so that we can show the gains of trade. So which is why it's advisable for you to be able to at least reproduce this graph in your drawing, right? Because once you put it anywhere else, it might not really clearly illustrate the point that you are trying to make. All right. So which means at that point, as I've indicated, is the autarky price. So which is what basically our producers at that point, it illustrates how much our producers are willing to lose in terms of product Y to produce more of X, or X to produce more of Y. So it gives us the relationship in terms of production between Y and X, right? So how much one product is worth in production. And then because it coincides with on the indifference curve, with at that point there on the indifference curve, it should therefore mean on the other side, it gives us how much it's worth for the consumers, how much a consumer is willing to sacrifice. So think about back in the days when people were doing barter trade. So you would have to exchange product Y for product X. So at some point in your consumption, you'd say, I can take maybe 3 of X for you to give me 1 Y, you see. And then maybe as time goes on, it might change then. But at a stated point now, it basically gives us the price, so the price of it. So we are saying it's equilibrium now because it's the same for consumption as well as production. So it's the same. So that basically gives us a clearer view of what the price is, right? So the shape now, so which means when you have the price on point A, you can basically draw a straight line there, which they say in English, it's tangent, meaning it simply touches that point there, right? So if you remember in your math, maybe in high school, where you had to draw or where you had to calculate the gradient of a curve. So the gradient of a curve changes, right? It changes over a certain range, right? It doesn't stay the same, but they would ask you maybe to find the gradient at a certain point. What would you do? You'd put a dot on that point and then draw a line and then look for 2 points on that line, and then you calculate the gradient, which is the slope of that line. So what does the slope of a line now tell us? So the slope of a line basically gives you, again, the price, like I'm saying. It gives you the price of Y in terms of X, or X in terms of Y. Basically the same thing. And for instance, if you have a line that, let me see if I can draw us a line here to illustrate this point. Suppose you have a line now that looks like this, right? A line that looks just like this, right? This is just to illustrate. So this line, it's a straight line, so the gradient is the same. So it means at any point, in order for you to get 60 of Y, you need to sacrifice how many of X? 110. So it basically gives you the price of X in terms of Y, or again Y in terms of X. You can look it up anyhow. So let me show you how we can do that then. Right, I want to share the screen as it is so that I can get a calculator there. All right, there we go. So the price now, let's start off with the price of X, right, in terms of y. Right? So in other words, if we're saying we want the price of x, we want to know 1x is equal to how many of y. That's what we basically want to know. So let's do again, let's deal with that line one more time. Let's do that line one more time. So it was moving on 60. Let's put it on 60 and 90 there. Right. So in getting the price of x in terms of y, we are basically saying 1x is equal to how much of y. So which means given that this is 90x is equal to 60x, it should therefore mean that the price of x in terms of y should be 60 divided by 90. Right? Then you can punch it there. Why is this not punching now? Right. Gonna be 60. Right. 60 divided by 90. Right. So the price of x in terms of y is equal to how much? 0.66. Right. Now let's look at the price of y in terms of x. So it should be 90 divided by 60. So 90 divided by 60 is 1.5. So based on that, now you can already see which one is more expensive to produce in the country, because one costs 1.5 and the other costs 0 point something. So which means it's cheaper in that country to produce X than Y, which is that illustration there, right? Which is what's being illustrated there, right? So bringing this to context now, bringing this one to context, this is how this is going to be, right? And by the way, in an exam, you don't really need to give so much detail, right? This we are doing because it's a class. I'll just let you know which one is important for the exam. So this is the straight line now that illustrates the autarky prices. So which means if you can get the gradient of that line, it basically gives you the autarky prices there. So what's important now for us to know is, looking at the gradient of this line, the fact that it extends more on the x-axis than on the y-axis, it shows us that it's cheaper to produce X, commodity X, than commodity Y in that country. So which is going to be leather on this side and steel. So hence, nation one, or that nation there that's labor abundant, should naturally produce more, or should be in a position where they can produce more of the commodity on the x-axis, and the opposite happens here, right? You can see that it extends more on the y-axis than on the x-axis. So therefore, it should mean that nation 2 here is what is capital abundant. So in drawing your graph, those are the illustrations that you want to make. You want to show which one is labor abundant and which one is capital abundant. Number one, from the shape of this, right? And then number two, again, from that line there, you want to show, well, that basically shows that anyway. All right, so what happens now, since we are dealing with trade, right? What happens when trade occurs, right? Given that nation one now, based on the shape of this PPF, is more efficient in producing commodity X, therefore we can argue that nation one should specialize more in, or should produce more of X than Y, because they can produce this one cheaper, right? Doesn't make sense for you to produce something that is difficult for you to produce when you can produce something that is a little bit easier for you to produce, right? So which is why nation one begins to specialize now in the production of the commodity that they are good at, which is commodity X, right? So in terms of specialization now, specialization simply means that they are moving their production from A to point B there. What does that mean? So as you are moving on the PPF from A to B, moving in that direction, you are exchanging some of your production of commodity Y for X, right? So you are taking more of X in exchange for Y, right? So remember, the PPF shows us how much of one commodity we can produce, right? And how much of the other commodity we can produce. We can't produce them. There is opportunity cost. We can't produce 150 for all of them. right? In order for us to produce the other one, we need to sacrifice the other one. So this gradient there, as we are moving, they call it the marginal rate of transformation, which represents the sacrifice, right? As we are moving from one to another. So you always want to move from the expensive one to the cheaper one, right? So which maybe if you would like to explain that, you are saying it simply means that the shape of this PPF curve, of this PPF, shows us that they can produce this commodity relatively cheap, right? So which is at a smaller opportunity cost, as we're saying in Ricardian language, right? At a smaller opportunity cost. So this sacrifice moves us from A to B there, right? Moves us from point A to B. So it doesn't exactly get up to, say, we say this is about 140. Why? Because of incomplete specialization, right? In reality, it's not exactly possible for a country to stop producing one commodity entirely in favor of another. So it's realistic to assume incomplete specialization, right? So complete specialization would be a movement from A right up until to that point there where we are saying how much of Y are you producing there? You are producing 0 of Y and only producing X. So which is not realistic. So we stick to point B there. So what's special about point B now? Point B is the international trade price, right? Where we are saying now the prices are equalized, right? The prices are equalized. So in terms of, remember in our illustrations, we always say if you exchange, like in this instance, they're saying if you exchange 60X for 60Y, you see. So we are saying if you're exchanging 60X for 60Y, then you are basically assuming a price, an equal price, where you are saying X is equal to Y. That's the assumption. So which is why the gradient of this line here is going to be equal to 1, where we are saying you are exchanging these things equally. So that's the assumption that we do to make these illustrations, right? So now it's an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth when we are dealing with this now in international trade. So which means you realize that though here, fine, it's cheaper to produce X at that point, right? But as a result of the exchange that we are making, right? As a result of the exchange that we are making, we are basically going to be at that point now. We are basically going to be at that point where we are exchanging these things equally in fairness, right? So if you extend, therefore, that line going that way, if you extend that line going that way, you can see now our new equilibrium is going to be on point E, right? Which is where we are now consuming. So this is a totally different indifference curve now. So the rule with indifference curves is that the higher it is, the more desirable it is. It basically represents better satisfaction. So here, what they are basically illustrating is the gains of trade, right? You see now that we are consuming at a higher indifference curve than before, right? We are consuming at a higher indifference curve than before. So which means the population is better happy, it's better satisfied now. We are on that higher indifference curve. But in terms of production now, we obviously couldn't have gotten there in isolation because we can only produce up to that point, right? But now we are consuming at that point as a result of exchanging, right? So this is simpler to understand if you take it this way. We can't produce most of Y, right? As much of Y as we want because of the fact that we don't have as much Y in that particular country, right? So we need to produce X and exchange it for Y. And then when that happens now, we start consuming at a higher indifference curve because you can already see that Y, we are actually consuming at 80 there, actually consuming at 80, you see. And then when it comes to X, we are consuming there at 70. So which is still higher than where we were on 50 there. Now we are on 70 there in terms of consumption, right, of commodity X. And then if you look at Y again, we are now higher. We moved from 60 to 80 right there. Right, so let's read the explanation there at the bottom. So with trade, nation one moves from point A to point B in production, right? Because they are specializing now. Right? Then by exchanging 60x for 60y with nation two, so we are seeing triangle BCE, that's BCE. Nation one ends up consuming at point E on indifference curve 3. So we go on again to explain that indifference curve 3 is higher than indifference curve 1, so it represents a higher level of satisfaction. So thus nation 1 gains 20x and 20y from trade, right? That's what I was illustrating there. If you look at the movement from 50 to 70, and then if you look at again the movement from 60 to 80, right? And then compared with that autarky there, right? And then similarly, that's what happens again on nation 2, right? That's what happens there again on nation 2 as we're moving from A1 to AP. So let's just quickly look at nation 2, right? Nation 2 is moving now from A1 right through to B1, right? Illustrating that there is specialization now because they can produce Y better than X, so they should rather produce Y and then exchange it for X. So that's what they are doing. So this movement along this curve shows us that there. So they end up getting to that point. So again, we extend. So this line here, P is equal to 1, PP 1 is equal to 1, is the same line as that one there. Right? It's basically the same line in terms of the gradient, because that equal to 1 basically represents the gradient of that line. So that's what that one shows us there. Right? And then like we did there, you can basically extend that line to give you a new equilibrium point there, which is on point E, and then you can have the other indifference curve again to give that illustration there, right? So there's going to be a movement. Therefore, if you look at A and E, there's going to be a movement from 80 to 100, right? And then the other one, there's going to be a movement between 60 and 40, right? So which basically illustrates those gains of trade, right? So which are the gains of trade under increasing costs. So in terms of the numbers here, right? In terms of the numbers here, I know it can get a little bit complicated when you have to draw this thing and then to rightly put the numbers again. But what I would maybe advise, right? If you find that sometimes maybe drawing this is going to be time consuming, particularly when you start putting in the numbers, you find that now your 60 is not aligning with that A there, and then now you need to cancel this thing and then reshift these points. What you could do there is put in maybe some letters, right? Maybe this is a big letter, right? In this instance, we will know what nation 1 is, right? We will know what nation 1 is. Like it will be an actual country, and nation 2 will be an actual country, and then Y is going to be an actual commodity still. So instead of putting prices there, you can simply put maybe Y1 at that point there, and then put an illustration, maybe a dotted line there to show that this is the price there. It's given as Y1, right? And then you can give that there as X1. So to illustrate the gains therefore in trade, you can maybe show it in this manner. Let me see how quickly I can draw this thing. Suppose, let's see if we have dotted lines here. Okay, we don't have dotted lines. Let's make a dotted line. Right, no, it's not working. Right, let's say, right, let me perhaps use a different color. Okay. Right, so this is what you have there at point 80 at that point, and then that one is 70 there. So it would be nice to illustrate this using a dotted line. It would be very nice if you can do that. All right, there you go. Now you have your 2 points and you've labeled. So you wouldn't really need now many of these other points, right? You just need to show that, okay, this is x1 and this is x2. So which means the gains there in terms of x is going to be x2 minus x1. And then the gains in terms of y is going to be y2 minus y1. That's what you could simply show there, right? And then if you want to put numbers, maybe I would advise therefore that you start off by drawing what's inside here, right? And then you can align your numbers to the points, because it's difficult now to do it the other way around, to start off with the numbers and then align the drawing. Remember that these are curves, right? These are curves, so they are going to be a little bit difficult for you to align there. All right. Now we will move on from this. So I'm going to ask you, therefore, to draw this here, right? I'm going to ask you to draw this, right? And then make sure that you put in place of x's and y's now, you're putting in what? Your own letters and your own numbers. Numbers, I don't think they would care much about numbers. I don't think they would care much about numbers. But if you don't want to put numbers, you can put those letters instead. But what they are going to be very much interested in is your understanding in terms of putting in the right countries, right? Putting in the right countries and the right commodities. And then you should be able to explain that. Okay, and then moving on from this now, one other thing that I could show you on this one here, right? One other thing that I would like to show you on this one is, given now that we can, let's go to chapter number 5, okay? Given now that you can, given the explanation that I gave now, let's look at the factor endowments theory, right? And then you will see now that what we are talking about there. Right. So now we've put in nation 2 and nation 1 in one diagram. If you realize that, if you compare between those two there with the previous diagram. So this is what we've done there. And then you've got our indifference curve number 1, and then we've got indifference curve number 2. So this is pretty much the same diagram. And then PA1 is still representing the price there, right? Which is the price in isolation, right? We refer to those as autarky prices. So it gives you the price of commodity Y in terms of X, or X in terms of Y. And then that one there would give you the price of X in terms of Y and Y in terms of X, but in nation 2. So that's still the same thing, right? In principle. And then what happens when there is trade? You see this line now, PP1. On this line now, we are basically doing an equal exchange now. We are now doing an equal exchange where you are exchanging one commodity for another equally, X to X or Y to X. So this still explains the same thing, right, that we're doing. Now you can see that we are now consuming on a different indifference curve there, which is indifference curve number 2. So it's still the same thing there. So let's read the explanation there. So indifference curve is common to both nations because of the assumption of equal tastes, right? So our questions, again, never quite made any specific assumptions. So which is why I'm saying in theory, this can also work out, but I'll say why they wouldn't exactly want you to put this one. So indifference curve 1 is tangent to the production frontier of nation 1 at point A there, and then we've got that other one there on point B. So this defines the non-trade equilibrium relative commodity price, PA in nation 1 and PA1 in nation 2, right? That's there. So since PA is less than PA1, right, in nation 1, so they are basically saying we are looking at the prices now, right? Nation 1 has a comparative advantage in commodity X, right? So it's cheaper, you can see now it's cheaper to produce X in nation 1 than in nation 2. All right. And then with trade, right, nation 1 produces at point B, right? And then by exchanging X for Y, it reaches point E in consumption. And then nation 2 produces at that other point, and then by exchanging X for Y, it coincides at that point. So both nations gain from trade because they consume at a higher indifference curve. So you realize now that you could squeeze in this explanation on exactly what we're talking about there, right? Except that now, in terms of the gains of trade, now you can illustrate that there's a movement there from, if you look at on nation, let me just connect this here before it goes off. If you look at this here on nation B, for instance, right, we've moved our consumption from there up to where, right? Okay, sorry, we moved our production from there, A, up until there. So if you look at now the changes, it's going to be from that point to that point, right? So your illustration now should indicate that this is where we were and this is now where we are, right? So which means the X movement between that point and that point represents the gains in terms of X, and then this small Y movement there basically represents the other gains. All right. So you see that these graphs can be drawn to illustrate the same thing. But which one do you use now? Then you want to go back to the question and see where the emphasis is on the question, right? Where the emphasis is on the question. Right? And then in most cases, again, if you are going to be dealing with this model here, or this theory here, they are going to be specifically talking about either they will ask you straight up about the HO, right? They might simply ask you that to do the HO in most cases, or maybe anything that has got to do with factor endowments, then you know, therefore, that this is what you need to deal with. Other than that, in other cases, then you need to be dealing with that other graph that we started with first of all. So which means your work to do now is to draw that graph, and then once you are done drawing that graph, you can refer back to me, maybe make some changes, and then show me where there is a change, maybe illustrate where there's been a gain, right, in terms of gains of trade. All right, so you get your 15 marks on that one. And then 2B, now assume two countries, Malawi and Japan. Malawi is labor abundant and Japan is capital abundant. Assume further that good A is labor intensive and good B is capital intensive. Explain how trade between two nations will affect the factor prices and how income will be distributed between these countries. So there are two things here that this question focuses on. So number one, explain how trade between these two countries will affect the factor prices, number one. And then number two, income will be distributed in these two countries. That's number two. So I would assume that you can do 5 marks on that one. So, but before you get there now, you need to be able to predict the pattern of trade. How are these countries going to trade? That's the first thing that you need to be able to predict from there. So obviously, Malawi is labor abundant. So Malawi is going to concentrate on which commodity? On the labor intensive commodity, which is A. So which means you can therefore state that Malawi is going to produce A, which is labor intensive because they are a labor abundant country. And then Japan is going to produce B because they are, B is capital intensive, and then Japan is capital abundant, right? And then it might not be necessary for you to state why that's the case, right? Because it's not really the main focus of the question. So how is trade going to take place now? Malawi is going to produce A and then trade it for B, right? And while Japan is going to produce B and trade it for A. That's the starting point. That's the introduction there. So how will that affect the factor prices now? Now we are dealing with the issue of factor prices. So in terms of factor prices, Malawi is labor abundant. So what's the factor price of labor, given that Malawi is labor abundant? we can conclude, therefore, that labor is cheaper. Based on all these explanations that I've been giving today, you can therefore conclude that in Malawi, labor is cheaper than capital. Why is that the case? So we are looking at ratios in this instance, right? We're not just looking at money in terms of this one is getting paid, how much rents per hour. We are looking at these things in comparison with each other. So labor to capital. So to sound smart in these circumstances, you will therefore say the labor to capital ratio in Malawi is what is small, right? The labor to capital ratio in Malawi is smaller than the labor to capital ratio in Japan. And then on the other side, so what does this give us? It gives us the factor prices generally. It's basically giving us the factor prices. And in terms of factor prices, again, I will talk about two things there, but let's proceed to Japan. So with Japan, because capital is abundant, so which means capital to labor is going to be small, right? Whereas in Malawi, capital to labor is going to be big. That's what you are basically saying there. So in terms of factor prices, right?
Thando, please repeat that. Please, Thando, can you please repeat this part of Japan and capital and please repeat your last sentence.
Last sentence. So Japan, because Japan is capital abundant, so you can therefore conclude that the ratio of capital to labor is smaller than the same ratio in Malawi, right? And in terms of that, let me see if I can quickly make an illustration there. Maybe it could also help. Right? And that one could also help. Let me share a different screen on Excel. Right, so K to L, which is the ratio of capital to labor. So if, let's say, K to L is right. What's going on now? Let's just say K to L is is equal to, I just want to illustrate that point, right? 5 to 2, right? K to L is a ratio of 5:2. What does this show us now? It means if you are going to reduce this, right, in terms of, remember, L is at the bottom and K is at the top, right? So which means if at the bottom you want to remain with 1, you are basically going to get the price of labor in terms of capital, the exchange ratio between those two. So you'll have 5 divided by 2, which is going to be 2.5. So which means if labor is 1, then capital is basically going to be 2.5, right? It's basically 2.5. So you can already see now that in this instance, we are now illustrating based on this that there is more capital than labor in that particular country, right? So if this is the case, then capital needs to be cheaper, right? And then labor needs to be more expensive. Then you can as well do that the other way around. You can even put it as K is to L, right? And then you can say, maybe let's put 7 is to 2 there. So if we divide that, 7 divided by 2 is going to give you 3.5 there, while we have a 1 on the other side there. Right. So which means in this particular country, we've got more labor than capital, just as an illustration. So whenever you find it hard to explain, maybe come to the question and then give your own assumptions there, show your own assumptions, basically show your own assumptions there. There is a graph for this illustration here, by the way, but I don't think they actually don't require it here, right? But however you illustrate it, you basically want to show that the price of the differences in factor prices, right, as your starting point, that because Malawi is labor abundant, right? How do you see that it's labor abundant? You can then do the ratio of K to L, and then illustrate now what that ratio tells you in terms of the price, right? What that ratio tells you in terms of the price. So in terms of the price, a labor abundant country is going to have cheaper labor, right? And then a capital abundant country is going to have cheaper capital, right? But given that you are only doing this for 5 marks, you don't need to struggle much, right? And then two things that I said now we could mention in terms of factor prices. Factor prices can either be factor prices in terms of in absolute terms and in relative terms, right? In absolute terms and in relative terms. So in absolute terms, we are merely looking at the absolute numbers. Then in relative terms, it's going to be in comparison in terms of capital to labor or labor to capital when we are juxtaposing those two prices, right? So now you can then move on to the next point and say, as a result of trade now, it means that Malawi is going to produce more and more of which good A, right? They are going to produce more and more of good A. Why so? Because some of their production now needs to cater for the demand in Japan, right? Remember our illustration on that PPF curve where there was a movement there from point A to B, where we are saying there was incomplete specialization. So this is still what we are talking about there, right? Because Malawi is good in producing commodity A, they should produce more of A and less of B, right? So as they are producing more of A, though they are consuming a certain part, some of what they are producing is now being consumed by Japan. So which means if they are producing more, right? If they have to be producing more of good A, what does good A require? Good A requires what? Let me highlight. Good A requires what? Labor, right? Requires a lot of labor, and because Malawi is labor intensive, that's why we are saying they should specialize in that. So why is it so it is labor abundant? So why is it good for them to produce that? Because we already said labor is very cheap in that country, right? So which means this means to say that labor is slightly expensive in Japan, right? So if you are going to compare these countries one next to the other, and then you'll say Malawi has got cheap labor, Japan has got slightly more expensive labor. So which is why Malawi should stick to producing commodity A. But here is the trick now. Malawi is not just producing for Malawi now. They are now producing also for Japan, because what do they want to do? They want to trade. Let's put this in a different color. They now want to trade, right? So which means that because good A needs labor, now we need more of good A so that we can also produce to give to Japan. Then it means there's going to be an increase in what? In the demand for the labor that produces good A. So when there is an increase in the demand of the labor that produces A, what happens to the price of labor? It goes up, right? Then now we can move to Japan. So our first conclusion is that the price goes up. Let's move to Japan. Let's use green for Japan. So Japan is capital abundant, right? Japan is capital abundant. So meaning they should stick to producing good B. Why so? Because good B requires a lot of capital, right? It's capital intensive. So which means it makes sense for them to produce more of good B, right? And now, because of trade, they need to produce more and more and more of good B, because some of that good B needs to be consumed in Malawi, because Malawi is producing less and less of good B, right? So what happens to the price of capital in Japan as a result of an increase in the demand of good B? The price is going to go up. So this is what we call factor price equalization. So which means at the end of the day, the price of labor as a result of trade, the price of labor in Malawi will end up being equal to the price of labor in Japan. Right. Let me illustrate this on the other side now, again, which we should not forget to mention. The fact that Malawi is moving from good A, so it's moving from, is basically moving towards producing more of good A. And we remember that for them to produce more of good A, they are sacrificing some of the good B that they were producing. So it basically means that the demand for good B in Malawi is going to drop, right? Why so? Because Malawi, okay, not the demand for good B per se, but we could put it that way. The demand for good B, but the real sense is the demand for the capital that produces good B is going to go down because we are not producing more and more of good B, right? So why I'm saying we cannot exactly say the demand for good B is going down is because we are still getting good B from Japan, right? So the demand may still be the same, but in terms of local production now, we are going to require less and less of the capital that produces good B. So remember that capital is expensive in Malawi, and as the demand for that capital goes down, what happens to the price of that capital? It has to go down as well, right? It can't stay expensive because the demand for that capital is low. So while the demand for this one, which is initially high, right, is going down, sorry, not the demand, while the price of capital in Malawi, which is initially high, is going down as a result of the demand that is going down. The opposite is happening in Japan, right? In Japan, it was initially cheap, but as a result of an increase in that demand, then it's going up. So which is why at the end of the day, the price of capital in Japan is going to be the same as the price in Malawi, and then the price of labor in Malawi is going to be the same as the price of labor in Japan, because while one is going up in one country, it's going down in the other country. So it will end up being equal. That's what the theory is about. And then, and the two countries will affect the factor prices. So we are done with the factor prices, and then how income will be distributed in these two countries. So in terms of income now, one thing that you might want to look at now, since there are no assumptions that they've been put up there, we can then put up the assumption of mobile and immobile factors, right? Suppose, let's deal with labor. Let's look at labor, for instance. Let's start off with labor based on this here. So we want to first explain what goes on based on the explanation that we've given there. That's going to be our starting point, and then we digress a little bit towards the end so that we cover most part. So in terms of labor, labor was cheap initially in Malawi. What happened now as a result of trade? It became expensive, right, as a result of that demand. So what's happening with the income there, which means that the income of these ones here is basically increasing. That's understandable, right? Because initially they were earning a certain amount, say $15 per hour, right? And then because there is more and more demand of the products that they are making, because it's being exported, the price goes up. Maybe it goes up to like 30 or so. So which means the first point to make there is that there's going to be an increase in income for the suppliers of labor, right? For the suppliers of labor. And then the opposite is happening for the suppliers of capital in Malawi, because less and less, initially it's expensive, but because less and less is required of that capital, it gets cheaper. So which means what happens there in that country in terms of distribution of income, it's equalized, right, between these owners of capital, right? You can notice that it's being equalized because these ones were earning high, the capital holders were earning high, now they're earning slightly less, right? And then the labor holders were earning less, now they're earning slightly high, right? Japan, the opposite is happening. Capital is cheaper, it's initially cheaper, but as a result of an increase in demand, capital is getting expensive. So which means the owners of capital are getting more compensation, right? They are getting more income, while the owners of labor are getting less. So that's what happens. So this is again the distribution in those countries. It's basically being equally distributed now between the owners of these. capital. And then in terms of digressing now, you can then, in conclusion, mention that in most instances, the owners of capital, or what did I say, the fixed capital, right, or the immobile, the owners of the immobile sectors of capital that is attached to the exporting industry gain, right, while the ones that are in the importing industry gain. And then the opposite is true again. So which means, what does that mean? If you look at in Malawi here, Malawi is exporting the good that produces, that uses a lot of labor in its production. So which is why the price of labor was going up. So suppose labor couldn't move from Malawi to Japan, right? Then it means that these ones are basically now gaining, right? If it's an immobile sector, and then they are now gaining, right, as a result of that export. And then here the capital owners are the ones that are gaining. All right, we will move on from this one. We want to see what other diagrams. Okay, and then with here, if the nominal tariff rate on consumers of leather shoes is 40%, and the ratio of imported leather to leather shoes in the absence of a tariff, it's 0.5. And then the nominal tariff rate on leather is 40%. Calculate the effective rate of protection afforded to producers. So in terms of this here, there's a formula that is used, right? I'm gonna search for that formula shortly. We'll do it together. We are merely substituting that. In fact, maybe I should as well give you that to do as well. I'll show you where to get the formula and then how to get that. So it's just mere substitution. But what is effective rate of protection? So the reason why a country puts in these direct controls or wants to, interfere directly with trade is to protect producers in most cases, right? The primary cause or the primary intention is to protect producers. What is dumping? I think we had a question on one of the assignment questions on one of these assignments that we did, multiple choice assignments, where they spoke about dumping, and then we're saying some countries can engage in this activity of dumping, whereby they are selling products cheaper than cost, right, or at below cost, basically dumping products like way below the cost in another country, right? So what effect does that have? It means that they are killing the production in that other country. We had one situation here not so long ago where Brazil was dumping their chickens here, right? Brazil was dumping their chickens here. The chickens were very cheap, right? I don't know how they were producing them, but they were GMO chickens, and from what I heard, they were basically growing those chickens in 2 weeks, right? They would raise them in just 2 weeks and then export those chickens. I don't know how healthy that is, right? It doesn't sound very healthy. But what they did is they would basically come and dump those chickens in other countries, or dump those chickens in other countries, unsuspecting countries. So the price of that chicken, because they can produce it way, way cheaper as a result of this technology that they have, that price of that chicken will be lower than the production cost of chicken in that country, particularly here in South Africa. So let's say chickens are going for, I bought a chicken not so long ago, they're like 100 rand. By the way, if you want to buy a walking chicken, a moving chicken, it's about 100 rand. So that's representative of basically the cost and the labor that goes into producing that chicken, right? The feed and what have you. If you have raised chickens before, you will know that they are not cheap to raise. You need to feed those chickens. There's lighting and the likes. So they then conclude that a suitable price would be 100 rand. Those chickens are like maybe at most 2 kgs. Let's just say at most 2 kgs or 1.5 to 2 kgs thereabout. Then now you go and check the price per chicken. These imported chickens, they're like going for 40 rand, 30 rand or so. You see, it's way cheaper now. So that is dumping. So what can the government do? Therefore, they can engage if they don't want to add. What our government did at that time, I think, was to ban them. I can't remember too well, but they were banned. I know even in other countries they banned these GMO products totally. We produce some of our own here, by the way. I once stayed in some farm not so long ago where they were growing carrots. Those carrots take like 2 weeks to grow. You see, like you watch them grow. That's how bad this thing is. These carrots that we have moving around, like being sold around here. So at the end of the day, the government can intervene now or interfere, particularly if we are importing these commodities, right? Because it's not fair for the local producers, right? It's not really fair for the local producers because there's literally nothing that they can do to fight that. So the government can either put in an embargo, right, where it's an outright ban, right, or they can maybe put in these quotas, right. A quota, you're simply limiting the quantity, right, saying similar to what's happening with eggs. Now, if you guys have been to Woolworths, I saw in one Woolworths here, they are saying one customer must only buy, you see that little box of 6 eggs. Yeah, so that would be similar to what's happening. If it's an import quota, you get to the border and they say we only allow this certain quantity per customer, or it could be per day, or whatever the case is. So that's similar to what will be happening in a quota. You only get 6 eggs per day, right? And then the other one now would be to put a tariff. So here we talk quite a lot about tariffs because there's a graph that I would ask us to draw on tariffs. So a tariff now needs to be an effective tariff, right? Needs to be an effective tariff. Because what's the effect of a tariff, for starters, or what's the main purpose of a tariff is to restrict the import of a certain good or a certain commodity. We are trying to restrict. And then why are we doing that? We want to protect the local producers, right? So a tariff is basically a percentage that is added now. We are saying, okay, we are importing these things at 100 rand per 50 kgs. Now we are saying per unit, we are going to be importing this at 100 rand plus 50% on that. So you will effectively be importing that at 150 rand. So that's a tariff. So for per each unit, there's a certain percentage that is added, which goes in now to SARS, right, as government revenue. But now, what then becomes an effective tariff? Why do we then need to calculate an effective tariff? So a nominal tariff now is this tariff that I'm talking about, which is basically the one that you see quoted there, where they tell you that for such and such a quantity or per unit of this, you pay a tariff of, in this instance, they are saying on leather, let's just say per a unit of leather, you are paying 40% extra. That's a nominal tariff. Then now, in terms of an effective tariff, we are looking at how effective is that tariff in protecting the producers, right? So in other words, in achieving its goal, because what we seek to achieve mainly is to protect the producers, right? I said we're not going to go into consumers in terms of how good the product is in any case. That's it's not within our scope here. But we deal with, you want to protect the producers. So how effective are you now in protecting these producers, given a situation now that these producers still need to import some other raw materials in order for them to produce the commodity that you are trying to protect them against. Let's say if it's chickens, we import chicken feed, right? We import chicken feed. So how effective now is the rate of tariff, given that we are also importing chicken feed? And that's what this one seeks to basically calculate there. So if the nominal tariff rate on consumers of leather is 40%, so if you're going to buy leather, then it's 40%, then the ratio of imported leather to imported shoes in the absence of tariff is 0.5, and then the nominal tariff rate on leather is 40%. Calculate the effective tariff rate. So we are saying you are calculating how effective this tariff, like this nominal tariff, is in terms of protecting, in terms of protecting the producers. So let's have a look at the formula. So most of what you need to know here in any case is just the formula, right? It's just on the formula. So let's let me search it for you here. Let's just say effective rate, right? Let's copy that. So it will go take us straight to the formula. There you go. Wasn't that quick? Very quick, right? So what you need to do now, so since I said this is going to be part of your homework, you need to first of all get this formula. Now it's good, you don't really have to cram the formula, right? You see, I also didn't have to cram the formula, but at least I know how to access it quickly when I need it. So which means what's important now on your part is the substitution on the formula. So G, what is G? G is the rate of effective protection to producers of the final commodity, right? So in this instance, the final commodity is shoes, right? So how effective is that tariff on shoes in protecting the producers? Then what is T? T is the nominal tariff rate. So you are simply putting T there, the nominal tariff rate on the consumers of final commodities. I think it was 0.4 there. And then minus A1. A1 is the ratio of the cost of imported input to the price of the final commodity in the absence of tariffs that we are given, again 0.5. We take that, and then T1 is the nominal tariff on the imported input, which was I think 0.4. Again, you substitute that there, and then 1 minus this A1 you already have there, sorry, AI, you already have that, that's 0.5. So you simply substitute that there, you see. So we are simply putting these things here and substituting for these ones. So 0.5, you have it, then 40%, 40%. Simply calculate, you get your answer. Very easy, right? No thinking is required there. So this is on page, let's see. Okay, you can simply do the search like I did, but let's see what page this is on. Page 230. So you can simply get that there on page 230. Now assume that the nominal tariff rate is 40% and the ratio is still 0.5, and then the nominal tariff rate is 0. Calculate the effective rate of protection. You are simply doing the same thing, right? Now you are substituting for the other one, right? So when you get time today, now please do calculate that together with that graph. Calculate that and then send it through to me, and then we can see if what you did. I'm just gonna check if your answers are the same. I'm not gonna calculate. So if your answers are the same, I'll assume that it's correct, right? But we need to make sure here in terms of calculations, again, okay, the formula is here. In terms of calculations, you need to be careful because this is a numerator here. Oops, this one on top here is a numerator. That one is a denominator. So it simply means you need to solve this here first, and then you solve that there next, and then you can divide. And then this is T minus AI times TI. So the laws of maths there, BODMAS or BOMDAS, you first multiply these two. The answer that you get, you deduct from T. Right? And then here it's simple, it's 1 minus that amount. Then you can divide at that point. So such mistakes, I think I can pick up easy. If ever you make those mistakes, then I'll respond. All right. Next one, what conclusions can you reach generally about the relationship between G and T? Right. So which is the effective rate there of G, which is the one that you've calculated, and then T, which is the nominal rate. Right. That's what we are basically trying. So which means now you want to observe, right? You check your answer, and then you compare your answer with the tariff that's given, right? Which is gonna be 40%, and then again here you compare the answer that you get with that 40%, and then you can come up with a conclusion whether it increases or reduces, right? Oh, sorry, it's not the 40%, because the 40% also does not change. I think with T there, let's see what T is, since they are using G. So T is the nominal tariff on the final commodity. So I think, yeah, it is at 40% because the nominal tariff on the final commodity, let's see, consumers of leather shoes, which is the final one, is 40%. So you're comparing those two there, what happens. But I believe the way the question is structured, rather, to correctly answer this question, conclusions you reach generally about the relationship between G and T. Since T does not change, it's a constant there. The only thing that changes is G as a result of a change in TI, which is the nominal rate of leather there. Then in your comment now, you are saying, though the nominal tariff is 40%, when the nominal tariff on leather, right? Maybe you can say, though the nominal tariff on leather shoes is 40%, when the nominal tariff on leather, which is the input that is required in the production of leather shoes, shifted from, it was 40% initially to 0, the effect was, then you state whether there was an increase in the effective protection rate or a decrease. That's what you are stating there. All right. What conclusion? Okay, so we've done this. All right, and then 3B, assume country A produces and consumes tables. The autarky price of a table in country A is 100 Rand, and then the domestic production in the absence of production and consumption in the absence of trade is 160 units. Assume further that the free trade price is 40. Explain partial equilibrium effect of a 50% tariff that is imposed on country A's tables. Right. Note that your explanation must be detailed and must speak to the diagram that we have drawn. Okay, let's look at partial equilibrium now. So let's set the diagram there. So what we are doing is merely going to be similar, right? It's merely going to be similar there. All right. Right, so let's look at this. Fine. This is not what we want. This is not what we want. Okay, let me skip that again. Didn't we have one of these in like this is not what we need. Right. We want tariffs, right? Why am I not easily finding this now? Okay, let's start again. I do not for a large nation. Okay, it's probably at the back here. Okay, right, here we go. This is what we want. This is what we want. Got it. I think now we had moved ahead. All right, so let's go back to the question now. So the question is, assume country A produces and consumes tables, and then there is the autarky price, etc. So there's nothing said here in terms of this being a large or a small country. So you just assume it's a normal country, so which is the one that we are dealing with. So now you want to replace this detail with what's in the textbook there. So let's see how we can go about that now. So you draw here, you can easily start off with your x's, right, on the Cartesian plane. You can have your x and your y, or sorry, your x and your y there. And then now on this point, right, on this point now, when you move to, right, when you move to labeling this diagram, you want to have a point E, or a first initial point of equilibrium that's consistent with the information that's given. So what does that mean? assuming that the autarky price in that country is 100 rand, and then the production and consumption is 160 rand. So which means that's the equilibrium in the country. So which means at that point there, on your point here, let me get a straight line, a very thin one. So which means on this point here, instead of 30, what you want to have 160 there. Right? And then in terms of, instead of 3, what you want to have there, you want to have 100 rand. That's what they mean also when they say, do not reproduce the graph as you see it in the textbook. So initially they were saying, put in your own numbers. So now that we don't have our own numbers, we are actually given the numbers to put in. Then these are the numbers that we put in there. Then what's the free trade price? Let's have a look and see what the free trade price is. Right. Look at this line, it's still there. The free trade price now is 40 rand. So we can come back and put in a free trade price. So the free trade price is always going to be the last line there. Right? That's going to be the free trade price, because free trade is cheap, right? Because you are getting it from the cheapest option ever. So this is what you have there. Did it draw? All right, there we go. That's going to be your 40 rand right there. All right. I think I've illustrated that point. So you're going to have 40 there and then 100 there. Right. Now I can delete these lines. And then we proceed. So what's the tariff now? The tariff that has been put up is a 50% tariff on all the imports. So we are importing this at a free trade price of 40 rand. So a tariff of 50%, then you want the price is going to increase basically by 50%. So which is going to be times 1.5. That will give you a 50% increase. Or if you like, you can take 40 rands. So 40 rands times 50% of 40 rand is going to give you 60 rand. Right? So that's going to be the same as 40 times 1.5. So which means after imposing a tariff, then you are moving from there, which was the initial 40, to a 60 there. Now you talk about what's the effect of that, right? That's what they want, right? Let's see what the question is saying, but obviously that's what they basically want. Explain the partial equilibrium effect of that there. So what are we looking for there? Now I should start drawing again to emphasize the points. Let's put, what color can we put? Let's say, let's go, okay, let's use red, okay? We're using red, we can stick to red. So this is where we were now. So remember now, these are not gonna be the same now, right? This is where we were. In terms of the numbers are not gonna be the same. So we are not really given what numbers to put there, because we don't know how much they were importing and then how much the producers were producing. So here you are free to put in your own numbers, but where you were not free is on this one here, where we're saying it has to be 160, right? I think I'm right about that. We say this is 160. So you will have your 160 there. So obviously, if you have 160 there, you can't have 200 there, né? Because you must be going lower there. So if you have 160 there, drag this maybe to around 80 or 70, right? Even 60, whatever the case is. And then there again, in that direction, you are moving higher. If you had 160 there, maybe you can put a 250 there or whatever it is you want to put. Then your first starting point is to state that given the free trade price, we are importing the difference between what our local producers can produce, which is at that point, versus what the demand is, right? So our demand is there. So which means the difference between that and that is the import. So you can therefore put in your own, you can basically put in your own, I think we did this in the assignment also. You can basically put in your own numbers there, right? Which is going to be the difference between that and that. So we can't be expected to have the same numbers. on that one. Then once you put in now, once you introduce a tariff, what effect does that have now? So you've got your own numbers there that have changed. I think we had 40 there, that has moved to 60. So which means demand is going to drop, right? So which means there's going to be a slight reduction there in what? So the area under this curve there is consumer surplus. So there's going to be a reduction in consumer surplus, representative of this triangle, and then a gain in producer surplus, representative of this triangle there. So indicating a movement from there to there in terms of production, then a movement from there to there in terms of consumption, right? So there is a decrease there. So the area, that area there is a loss, and then that area there is a gain, right? And then what else is a gain? Right? Oh, sorry, I think I'm illustrating this wrong. This one here, why it looks the same, right? Why it actually looks the same is because it's this area there is the same as the one that will be on top there. So the actual gain is producer surplus is going to be this big portion here. Sorry about that. So which is the area of this triangle plus the area of this square there. This is a trapezium, I think. Yes. So forget what I said at this point there, because the producer surplus is the area on top of the supply curve, right? That's the producer surplus. So this is the gain here. My bad. So this is the gain, and then this is the loss. And then what else are we gaining now? We are also going to gain, the government is going to gain, because now all of this that is being imported, which is from point there, right, that point there to point there, between, in this graph, is going to be between 50 and 80. Basically, this box here is government revenue, right? Right. It's basically government revenue there. I actually illustrated this not so correct actually, but it's fine, because this is where, this is the dead weight loss there. Let's call that point X. Let's call that point X. Let me illustrate it differently though. I think I didn't say it right. So the whole part that we lose there, because now I had already put this triangle here, because part of what is lost is gained as government revenue. But let me say it the way it's supposed to be said. If you look at, since we are saying consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve, so which means practically speaking, this is the whole area from there to there that we are losing. This big trapezium that we are losing in terms of the surplus, right? In terms of consumer surplus. But not all of it is a loss, because in terms of welfare, country welfare, because part of it is being gained here, right, by producers, and then part of it is being gained there. It's being gained there by the government. So which means the only part that remains a loss is this X there, and then that other X there, which is going to be referred to as the dead weight loss. That's how this is supposed to be explained. All right. So maybe let me cancel this, since it's revision. Let me cancel this and then re-explain it again. All right. All right. So as we are moving from that point to that point, it's getting more expensive for who? For the consumers. So what do they lose? They lose this big portion here. Right? They lose this big portion right there. If I had the right equipment, I was going to draw it properly. Right. So this is what we are losing so far in terms of consumption. But part of it is being gained by producers, right? Which is that slight increase there in producer surplus. That's what you see there. And then part of it is being gained as government revenue. So assuming that our government is not corrupt, we assume that it's going to be used to enhance and improve people's lives. So that can simply be put in there as a gain. Right. So which means this was initially negative, it has become positive. So it means it equalizes there, right? And then it equalizes there again. So this one and this one remain negative and negative. So that's the dead weight loss there. I think it's an easier explanation for that one. So you can do the shading, right? You can do the shading, and then in terms of the effect now, this is the effect, the dead weight loss. So you are simply calculating now the area of this triangle and the area of that triangle there. That's the dead weight loss. So you could do that, or alternatively, you can simply calculate the big area of this trapezium here, right? And put it as a negative, and then you put a positive of what? Of the producer surplus and a positive of the government revenue gained here, which is the difference between there it's gonna be 60 and 40, and then times the amounts that you would have put there on the x-axis. Then you put that as a positive, then you would obviously get a net negative, right? Which is going to be given as the dead weight loss. All right. That's it on that one. So your homework now would be to draw this graph, right? And then instead of putting in, you can put SF there and SF plus T, it's fine. SX, X, DX is still fine, price is still fine, but you want to put in your numbers. If they haven't specified really, what are we consuming? Let's see, produces and consumes tables. Maybe you can, instead of X, you can put quantity of tables and price of tables. You could do that there. So you just replace those there and then send it through to me. Hey, I see you have a lot to do now. I'm leaving you with a lot of things to do.
What, hi, Tando.
Yes.
I want to know,
Yes,
when we are on this graphs on the textbook, can you go to the textbook, please? The last graph that we're dealing
yeah.
with. I want to check, let's say, for instance, they are expecting us to change only the numbers, not the letters. Is it possible that, I don't know how to put it, but can someone rephrase this?
Yes,
And
you can.
rephrase all this as it is, but change the numbers.
Yes, you can.
It's correct to do that.
Correct to do that.
Oh, okay. No, it's fine then.
Just as long as, because they never specified what letters to use. So you are allowed to even, you could have crammed this. You know what they don't like about reproducing a graph as it is? It will be a case where you are failing to apply the data that's given here. When you are failing to apply the data that's given in the question with the diagram, right? You are failing to get the issues of 40 Rand, the issues of 50%, and you're merely using the same tariff rates that are given. Here, the tariff rate is 100% from 1 to 2. So which means you simply need to illustrate that your one is moving from 40 to 60, representing a 60%, a 50% tariff increase there. So that's what you can do. And then also quantities are not the same. And then, so in terms of letters, you can simply put the letters or even not put them, because if you're hand drawing, you can simply shade these things. So the reason why they were putting them there, I normally prefer, if I'm handwriting, it would be nice to label these as maybe A, B, C, D, right? Because I can simply say triangle A, triangle B, instead of writing M, J, H, N, HNB like that. You can simply label that shape A, B, C, D, you see. So I think how I initially illustrated this was the loss is in terms of, if I didn't want, if I really didn't want to put in numbers there, then the loss is going to be A, B, C, D, and then the gain is going to be A, right? And then C. So which means the dead weight loss is going to be B and D. like that. So you can basically, we want to go for the simplest, or the ones where we can write fast and move away from the question. We want to go for that one. All right, and then question number 4. Now, I can't remember if we still get these questions, but these are scenario-based questions. So
no, we don't
we're
get that one anymore, ne? So let's
anymore, ne?
not. Yeah, we don't.
All right, so let's then end the session so that we give you guys enough time to go through this one. So please, maybe if you can go through it and finish it by tonight, ne? Send it through by tonight, and then tomorrow, please get another question paper for us to do. We will start class at 6 so that we can finish a little bit earlier, right? So we'll be doing another question paper, and then again, what should we do with this one? This one, which I said we are going to do last, we can do tomorrow as well, right? But then check also on if there are any videos where we did these questions. You can also go through those videos, but we will start off there on the next question paper. Right, so please do what I asked, the drawings, and then yeah, and then we can meet on the next session. Bye and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. We'll meet tomorrow.
Thank you, Tan.